and welcome to IRI Growth Insights, featuring IRI thought leaders, industry partners, and guests. For more than 40 years, IRI has been known for its invaluable data, but these podcasts delve into the insights the data reveal to fuel market disruption and market growth for those in the CPG, retail, healthcare, and media markets. I'm your host, Joan Driggs, coming to you from IRI's corporate headquarters in Chicago. Hello, and welcome to a special episode of IRI Growth Insights, where we're continuing a conversation inspired by our recent More Than Meet, M-E-A-T, More Than Meets the Eye webinar, which is available at iriworldwide.com. Today, my colleague Jonna Parker, principal of IRI's Fresh Center of Excellence, is joined by John Crowder, head of beef marketing at food processor JBS, and Heather DeLuca, Vice President of Meat and Seafood at AWG, that's Associated Wholesale Grocers, the nation's largest cooperative food wholesaler to independently owned supermarkets. So today we're talking a lot about meat, and no category changed as much as meat, I feel, during the pandemic. We ended up 2021 with $82.2 billion in sales, which is up 45% from 2016. But Jonna, I'm going to start with you. Given this inflationary period that we're living in right now, what is the current and future state of meat?
The inflationary period is really worth leading with because since December, we've been asking consumers, where are they seeing price increases at the store? And in December, it was the majority of folks were saying beef and pork, followed closely by poultry. Now, as we've gotten through each month, yes, other categories are now catching up, but that perception of meat being higher priced is certainly where it's the headlines. And the reality is, of course, that yes, certain meat cuts, especially the ones we buy most often, are where retailers are needing to have that price. We as an industry have dealt with so much in meat over the last 2 years. You know, we were excited at the Meat Institute last in-person conference, which was at the beginning of 2020, literally a week before shutdown. We were so excited and high-fiving over 2% growth. So when we saw the amount of volume that came to the retail meat industry, there's been so much that the industry has had to do to keep up with that demand. And obviously inflation's real and it's everywhere. So the reality of where we're seeing inflation and its impact on meat is yes, for the first time in the 2.5 years I've been tracking who adds the most dollars to the store, beef was not number one this past month, but guess what? Chicken was. And chicken, I'm sure John will have some thoughts on that, but chicken is lower price per pound. So when it comes to solving the meal, meat is still critically important. We're still seeing 8 of 10 meals made at home. We're still seeing extreme volume going through the meat department. But I hope, as we'll talk about today, and we certainly covered in our webinar, it's different. So, of course, I can tell you lots of stats about how the price of meat is up. But I think what's more interesting is the places where, even though it's up, people keep buying. And my favorite story in that really quick is during the football playoffs, we saw fresh chicken wings, which are one of the hardest and most expensive labor-intensive products for poultry producers to put on shelf. Fresh chicken wings did extremely well despite a 20% price increase, because that value of someone who really wanted to make their own chicken wings and have their own sauce and do it better than a food service establishment can do it is a huge reason why meat volume is up. And, you know, Heather, I'd love to hear as a retailer, because you're right in the throes of balancing value and trying to keep up with price points for the segment of the population that's watching the ads, as well as trying to capitalize on some of these new consumers. So what are you seeing at AWG as it relates to inflation in meat?
Yeah, so much, right? And there's just so much pressure. I think we were all starting, like you said, kind of to get excited about, seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. And now we have some other outside factors as well that are impacting price, whether it's, what's going on in Ukraine and fuel, et cetera, just challenge supply. You mentioned chicken, right? And chicken and pork. And those are where, as that gap between various proteins becomes bigger, we'll start seeing more of that shift down, maybe to some other proteins or, better priced cuts of meat. We love talking about premium and, the story of ribeyes, for example, or prime and that growth that was there. And I definitely don't want to take focus away from that, because as we still have shoppers that aren't eating out, right, and those meals are being cooked at home, regardless, it's still a better price, less spend to eat at home. So we don't want to completely shift away from that. And that's going to be our challenge right now, is how do we ensure that we have those solutions for the shopper that truly needs to stretch their budget, right? And it's, first of the month stock up, it's end of the month when we talk about the terrible twos, and what's that value we can provide, and solution. That's, I know, Jonna, one of your favorite words, and mine as well, is, from a merchandising standpoint in store, there's an opportunity to make sure that solution's there. We know circulars aren't as popular. So how is the shopper is walking the store and saying, how do I stretch my budget? Oh, look at this display, and, multiple package sizes, not just the large packs, but going on, different size families, and making sure that there's the price point options on different proteins. And just, as, ground beef, I would anticipate we're going to start to see, the prices up, but however, it's still within the beef category, right? A better value than some of the more premium cuts. So I do think it's still a little early to really, we're just starting to see some of that impact. We know volume's hurting. But as, some of that food service business that I think we all anticipated was going to pick up, we'll kind of wait and see what ends up happening. Right. But I would anticipate that that's going to, kind of stick at retail based on being a better value for the shopper.
Dawn, as a producer and in beef, which is such an interesting category, because if we're talking at a dinner party, people are like, oh, beef's so expensive. But I know you've had tremendous success with some of your higher value programs. So what's your perspective and JBS's on the current state of beef inflation?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jonna. I think the beef inflation has in some regards led some of the press and the publicity. We've kind of become the poster child for inflation in food, somewhat unfairly. And so, when we look at the price of beef versus year ago, in the latest data you guys released, Jonna, across all categories, beef doesn't even make the top 25 categories in terms of highest percentage increase. So, we are in at about 12.5% higher price than last year. We started to see price pressures and prices rise, into the second quarter of 21. And, we're just now getting to that overlap. So, we've looked at, and I think you guys point out very well, trip frequency in March on meat was actually up 2% versus year ago. So, everything we see indicates people are not going to slow down their consumption in meat and in particular in beef. We looking at a very recent study from January where really only 4.7% of consumers plan to eat less beef because of a higher price, right? So that means 95% of consumers are planning to either eat more or the same. And so, whether it's beef or chicken or pork, as America has shifted their meal occasions into the home, 80%, of meals are still being prepared in home. Meat is the anchor of darn near every meal, whether it's pleasing your family or really good value for the money. When you look at the amount of nutrition that you're getting, these prices are higher, but relative to the cost to get the same equivalent nutrition, meat is actually a value. And, similarly, beef consumers are telling us that 80% of consumers say in January that beef is a good value for the money. 78% say beef fits my budget. So I think it really is. It's become the anchor of all the cooking exploration and all the joyous occasions, the meal occasions that are happening in the home. It's kind of breaking out of the ordinary and, grilling a steak, et cetera. But I will say too, there's clearly the premiumization factor, right? And 40% of shoppers are looking for premium quality fresh meat. And so on those special occasions, when you're having friends or family over, or you want to impress your date, you're going to want to buy some prime beef, even though it's, a very high price per pound. So occasion to occasion, needs change. And as Heather said, there's so many different segments within these protein categories that afford you the opportunity to trade down, right? To get more value, whether it's going from a steak to a ground beef, or exploring offal as an opportunity to prepare new delicious dishes, at an even lower price point. So there's all kinds of opportunities there. We also, Jonna, you've pointed out, the super premium segments in fresh meat are really the only segments growing share. So people are spending more dollars and moving their share into these premium segments. So I could go on, but we continue to be excited. The trip frequency is up. We're coming into a favorable overlap. Easter is later this year. So, people worried about the last few weeks. When Easter kicks in, that's the beginning of grilling season. We're still very bullish. And we've seen overall consumption for beef has continued to grow, may have flattened out in 21 versus 20, but with 6% lower volume in the retail channel, but explosive growth coming back from the restaurants. People continue to eat as much or more beef than they have historically over the last 5 or 6 years.
So, John, you actually bring up a couple questions that I think I want to direct towards Heather. And that is two different fronts. One of them, and Heather, you spoke about this, Jonna, you spoke about this, all those meals being produced at home in a high inflation period. But John, you just totally triggered something. I just finished reading Jonah Berger's book, Contagious. And in it, he's talking about what happened during World War II and how, given the war in Europe, Americans were really encouraged to cook different cuts of meat, particularly offal, things like tripe and stuff. I don't see a lot of that occurring. Where does the inspiration come from for different types of cuts and different types of budget meals, aside from like that prime, throw it on the grill, cut of beef? So Heather, I don't know if you want to take like the budget part of it, or how does meat fit into my budget?
Yeah, I think, even just hitting on, the offal conversation, a lot of that ends up, we definitely have, different stores with different merchandising methods, and some have more than others. But traditionally, it's been more of a either like ethnic channel or the value, right? So of low price options. So some of it is, with trial, but then also supply. So if, a lot of that's being exported and it's not available, some of that product requires more processing too. So with the challenges in, meat plants, that may actually be an area that certain packers may have cut back on. So a lot of it comes down to availability, but, in terms of getting trial and what different retailers are carrying, that's one of the challenges. But yes, I mean, stretching the budget is definitely going to be a continued topic. But I love also just playing off of what John talked about with premium more is, as we head into grilling season, there's so much opportunity for the entertaining and for the celebrations and the gatherings that are going to be happening that haven't been happening, right? So really it's just making sure that we don't completely shift this focus and that we continue to merchandise those items and have them for the shopper that's looking for them, because there will continue to be that shopper, right? So that's looking to celebrate and spend.
And I want to piggyback on that, because I love that you're both hitting on these points. There really is, we think about the meat department as this homogeneous, huge thing. And yes, to quote our dear friend Anne-Marie Rohrink, meat superpower is variety. But what the last 2 now plus years did for America is start to lean into that variety. One of the things we studied in More Than Meets the Eye that we shared at that webinar in March was how there is this super heavy meat spender. And just as you'd guess, it is someone who's buying a lot of meat volume because they're feeding a larger amount of people in their home. But I think there's other segments that are occasion and interest based. And if you think about almost every other part of the store, certainly the one that is the number 2 highest dollar generating department, you can't think of it as just playing to the masses. We really have a couple huge opportunities that the pandemic opened up. One is that the average American now buys 42 different cuts and kinds in a year. Pre-pandemic, the best I can estimate is that was probably like 25. Near double amount of varieties, whether we're talking about offal or we're talking about pork ribs, or we're talking about, to John's point, different cuts of steak versus just ribeye, or leaning into something like a grass-fed for either a health, environment, or a taste perspective. America's listening, meat industry, and we're voting with our dollars. And we're voting in 2 ways. We're voting with what I'd call this experiential consumer, someone who feels very confident in their cooking skills and wants to know more about meat. Power of Meat every year for the last 5 have found a segment of the population that wants more education of meat. And guess what? That's a group that's trending younger, and they're seeking and heavily engaged in places like TikTok and Instagram and influencers. Meat is an activity for them, even if it's just them or their family. They are buying the really expensive grills and smoking their own meats and want to talk with someone who's knowledgeable. That is an awesome opportunity, especially in beef, but also in pork and even in turkey, right? We're seeing people do some really creative things around Thanksgiving every year. Further, there's the difference between occasion and everyday. And you guys know, if you're listening to this often, I also work a ton in the bakery throughout my career. And I now think the moment that's hitting meats with far more dollar potential is embracing the occasion. Just as both Heather and John have shared, we are entering what everyone in the meat industry knows as prime grilling season. But given that population has shifted to warmer climates, either part of the year or throughout the year, grilling can be 365. And the concept of grilling as the cornerstone of the gathering could be such a tremendous merchandising ideation with different options. And in some ways, it goes back to a really important central stat, which is the average American does not live with more than 2 to 3 people in their home. And yet, the first thing many of our clients, not necessarily Heather and John, but many of our clients asked us when inflation started to tick up in Q4 was, should I shift to larger value pack? Should I have the individual unit size demonstrate that price per pound value? And the reality is no, because consumers are very concerned about waste. And what they're actually looking more for is package sizes that meet the occasion. So think about the option. One of my local retailers here, Basha's, for example, merchandises 3 different types of proteins in a fajita, like a fajita party piece. We've also seen some really creative things where plant-based is positioned next to beef burgers for the potential of them buying 2 different packages to serve both those who are not into meat, but also those who love it. And I think that both of those, all of those options are just like, that's like less than 1% of what we're really seeing. But imagine if both online and in store, we really owned that meat is the anchor of the occasion and really celebrated that.
I'd like to have you talk a little bit more about value and not just price value. Because what you're talking about, you're talking about versatility and things like that. So what are some other opportunities to talk about the value of meat?
John, I'd love you to take that because I know that's been a heavy topic. You produce almost everything in the beef category. What are some of the ways that you're seeing with your research that value can be demonstrated?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the important points here that you guys have all mentioned is the size, right? And so the individual portions and Case Ready enables us to deliver now a 10-ounce ribeye, a 10-ounce strip, smaller pieces that, steak aficionados would be like, oh my gosh, that's way too small, way too thin, but thin cut ribeyes, thin cut strips, very easy to cook and prepare, but they're for individual portions for single or 2-person households. And so being able to purchase really awesome fresh meat packaged freshly at the plant, the meat's breaking down in its own juices, so it's even more tender. But being able to buy a single pack is a great value. Another value driver is the ability for people to go online now. Over the last few years, an explosion of content around how to easily prepare all these different cuts, all the different recipes to incorporate them in, has been phenomenal. And so, if I'm a new offal consumer, or I'm in the store and I quickly Google offal, beef offal, boom, up pops all these wonderful ethnic recipes from all these different genres and meal opportunities. And so, no matter what you buy, there's plenty of content out there to teach you how to cook it and prepare it and how to season it. And so there's great value in that as well. But for me, the ultimate value in beef, and consumers tell us this, is the nutrition factor. And I know we talked about this the last time, but the nutritional benefits of beef. Everybody realizes you get a lot of protein. A lot of times the pieces of meat only have the abbreviated nutrition facts, and they call out that it's a good source of iron. But there's 10 essential vitamins and minerals that beef provides, right? And so the value for us is to continue to focus on and communicate, extend that nutrition facts panel, and let people know that a 3-ounce serving of beef delivers 41% of your daily value of B12, 25% of B3, 39% of daily requirements on zinc. These are things that, people spend a lot of money on over in the pharmaceuticals aisle to try to get. And if they were to realize that just eating, a 3 or 6 ounce portion of beef delivers all these wonderful nutrients, right? So we've got to communicate those things to be able to continue to drive value with consumers.
It's so funny you talk about the nutrients and how if people just eat better, we wouldn't need all the supplements. I mean, I didn't think of beef and zinc as being, tied together. So that's really interesting.
One quick fun fact, just to piggyback on John, is we have now had 2 different rounds of a survey among our household shopping population, primary shoppers. And even surprising to me, but true, more people in America are following a high protein or keto specific diet than vegans or vegetarians combined. This concept of protein is very popular right now. And I think as an industry, in addition to all the great benefits that we mentioned, but it is a huge part of the population that sees protein fueled diet. And for the most part, the meat industry has embraced it. I think consumers have actually embraced it better than we have.
So that is a fun fact. And you are probably very fun at cocktail parties, throwing out like the conversation starters. So Heather, I want to kind of circle back to you because you mentioned how some of these cuts, even offal in particular, might be more of a strain on the processor because it takes more processing. And yet consumers are looking for more ease. And Jonna mentioned the fajita kits and stuff. So how much of that, the recipe ready or the meal kits, how much of that is falling to the retailer?
Yeah, from a labor standpoint, that's really an opportunity in terms of preparing those types of items, and that's something that we're focused on right now at AWG is how do we bring those solutions and have them ready, right? So John talked about prepackaged, case ready meat. It would be the same idea as long as the quality's there and holds up. There's an opportunity to help the retailer solve for that. But the whole, going back to the value comment, and something I'm very passionate about is just value added meat. And that, kind of contradicts the whole low price, right? And that's where with inflation, shoppers are still looking for help, trying to get dinner on the table faster. How do we help them solve that? And that is with, marinated or smaller cuts, recipe ready, right? And just that will continue to be an opportunity as we know that the younger shopper interacts, with those as well. So as their budget grows and as their families grow and they continue to look for those solutions, that's an area that I would predict is going to continue to grow and be an opportunity. So we talk about communicating value. It's not just right. It's not just the low price. It's what is the value that it's bringing to the shopper. And so that's where those smaller cuts and easier, ready, closer to getting the meal on the table will continue to be an area of growth.
Yeah, I really like that. That's an excellent addition to value. So I want to also touch a little bit on meat alternatives because they have ridden a certain kind of a wave throughout the pandemic. And I'd like to get a sense of where they are now and how that plays in the overall meat case.
The reality of alternatives, both in refrigerated and frozen, is they have a place. There is an important part that I think it's brought to the options. And, it's $1 billion business in 21, $1.2 billion. Where we're seeing the opportunity is in repeat. And so I think just like any good trend, especially one before, remember, meat alternatives and many of the items that made shelf in 20 had already been green lighted well before we could say what coronavirus was. And because of that, then they were on shelf, and then they were on shelf and a lot of people tried them in some cases because they were home more, or honestly, some of the cuts they were looking for weren't there. But where we're not seeing it is the repeat rate. We are seeing a above average for a new product churn of people who try and don't return. Now, that's solvable as we continue to demonstrate value through taste, through options, through new entrance. There's been a proliferation in the back half of 21 as well as the beginning of this year in poultry substitute and seafood substitute. So trying to do different things. We've also seen a lot more that are known ingredient based coming into the alternative space. But it's still different in meat alternatives than it is in dairy alternatives. In dairy alternatives, being able to say oat milk appeals not just to someone who's trying to eschew animal protein, but someone who's also potentially lactose intolerant. So I think, what we're seeing more in alternatives now is a focus on this flexitarian, someone who's trading in between meat and a more plant option, and also recognize that substitute isn't the only option to not eat meat. So I think there's still more work to be done on the marketing and innovation side, but I'm seeing it and I'm seeing it happen quickly. So I'd say the key takeaway is we as an industry can't just follow a trend and throw a bunch of Me Too items out there. We really have to anchor in what the consumer wants. But Heather and John, from your perspectives, what's your company's take right now on the alternative opportunity?
It's when you think globally about the population growth that's going to happen, right? Between now and 2050, another, 2.5 to 3 billion people will inhabit the planet. And there's only so much protein that we can produce and raise. So there is absolutely a need to feed the planet. There's definitely a need for these plant-based protein solutions that are going to be more and more important as time goes on. I would say too that there's been a lot of press and a lot of PR. And if you think about, plant-based is $1 billion in sales, and meat, as you opened, Joan, is 82 billion, right? Then, we ought to be spending 1.5% of our time, effort, and marketing talking about plant-based, right? And spend the other 98.5% talking about meat, but that's okay. We're used to talking about plant-based. I agree with Jonna. I think, we're almost half of all triers of plant-based today have not came back and purchased again. So there is a taste gap. We have a division in our company at JBS that's very focused on developing new high taste delivery products that can fill the bill and meet that need. So I think people, are exploring. The problem is once you try something and it doesn't taste good, it's really hard to get those people back. So I think it's going to be a balance. To your point, there's always going to be people looking to, move into more of a flexitarian mode and look for other solutions. I'd say just eat more salad. That'd be fine. But if you want to eat some plant-based meat as well, that's great. So you've got to have that variety, but balance it based on a space to sales kind of a mindset and realize that we're only talking about 2% of the total categories. And importantly, from a growth standpoint, right? The latest data from that Anna Marie shared in Power of Meat, that $1 billion of plant-based sales are up 4% versus year ago. Total beef, as an example, is up 1%. So, the gap of 82 million to 1, and really the growth pattern is becoming closer and closer. I just think we have to balance it. There's a role for it. Longer term, it's a global, opportunity to feed the world. Shorter term, because the other thing is, here in the United States, we're so blessed with the amount of meat and the assortment and all these great varieties that we're talking about here. It's unbelievable. We've got such a great variety in front of us here that, I think as time goes on, some of that variety will edge out into other parts of the world, but plant-based is going to have to play a much bigger role as population grows, especially in, some of the third world developing countries, which is where the most population growth is going to happen.
I would just add, I think you did a really good job of some of the comments I was going to make. You already did. So I agree with everything. I think just reiterating, right, the size, right, and making sure, like you said, there's a role, but that we're not, changing our meat case to 4 feet of plant-based and then, getting rid of other key items that really matter, right? So balancing, just like you said, is really important. And it'll be interesting to watch the evolution. And, right now we've got some in produce, some in meat, where it actually, ends up living. Flexitarian, we know that trend's continuing, especially when we look at that younger shopper and what their, the percentage there versus the older shopper. And so as it evolves and even from, taking it back to recipe ready or what's the form, what's the right form to sell it in, and, not trying to replicate eating a steak, right? But more ingredient based, the meatballs, the grinds, et cetera. And there is a place for it. And there's a shopper that is looking for it, but just making sure that it's in balance.
So as we wrap up, I just wanted to recap a couple of the things that I heard from you today. And that is, even though we're in a very highly inflationary period, we still have 40% of beef shoppers looking for those premium cuts. And we're also, as you mentioned, here we are right around Easter and Passover and moving into that big grilling season, that this is a huge occasion-based category. And people, it's very much ingrained in part of who we are as an American culture. So it's not going anywhere. The Jonna, as you mentioned, meat superpower is variety, that people are buying more and different types of cuts. 42 you mentioned, up from 25 pre-pandemic, which is incredible. And it includes that offal, which I am so clearly intrigued by. And I really loved the conversation around value and how there's so many other elements to meat beyond price, in terms of different cuts, all the nutrients that are packed in there. And especially, Heather, I think the convenience of different cuts and value-added products. Of course, we can't keep the plant-based meats out of the conversation. Maybe we're giving them too much volume right now, outpacing the volume compared to what it really is in reality. But it is something to watch as it evolves. And I love that you're saying, let it find its own place, its own flavor profile, its own unique attributes, instead of continually trying to just mock what already exists. So with that, I want to thank you all for your expertise. Again, encourage listeners to go and listen to More Than Meets the Eye webinar, and we will catch up again soon. Have a good day.
Thank you all.
Thank you for listening. Please become a subscriber and let us know what you want to learn more about. We'll serve it up in a future IRI Growth Insights episode. Look for us wherever you get your podcasts and be sure to review IRI Growth Insights. Also, visit us on the web at iriworldwide.com and connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn.